Well, good morning, everyone. I think, like me, you're feeling a little bit cheated because that conversation was going in exactly the right direction with some pretty important decision makers around the table. Because the remarks that the mayor was making are the remarks that we're going to quote back to him when we come and ask him to implement all of this. Because that's exactly the direction in which we need to go. Colleagues, I've got only a few closing remarks because we're only at the start of a very exciting day. Because after this session, there are 5 workshops that are happening. And they're very important workshops because they're going to be picking up exactly the issues that have been raised. I hope the Treasury folk have heard that maybe it's time that the WRC gets a parliamentary grant, ma'am. Modest numbers to start. But if we do not do what we're talking about, then we're not realizing the dividend of the investment we've already made. Because we have invested in good research, we've invested in great innovation, we've brought together very enthusiastic partners from the private sector. And I want to remind you that when we talk about the private sector, we're not just talking about big industries with laboratories and whatnot. Some of the innovations that you have seen here in this hall this week have been developed in people's garages on second mortgages. It's important to note that because people are not afraid to invest in their idea. They now need the right kind of helping hand to get all of that to the market. But before I get to my slides, I want to offer you a few points to ponder. First, a very philosophical one. I was looking at the world map this morning. And I know that when the world map was designed, and it was designed by Europeans, they wanted to represent the world with Europe in the center of the map. But when you look at that map, what do you see in the center? It's Africa. And they were right, because Africa is indeed the center of the world. So that one they got right. But I was also reminded, it's interesting the conversation that Oliver pitched, because last night I had a very similar conversation with JJ Tabani. Now, many of you know JJ. He's a pretty famous talk show host nowadays. Well, back in 2002, he was chief of staff of Minister Vali Musa, who was responsible for the South African participation in the WSSD. And I, at that time, for my sins, was policy coordinator of the South Africa position. And we were talking and lamenting that the great leaps and strides we had made in a thing called the Joburg Plan of Implementation, which very few people remember, did not actually find its way to implementation. It didn't elsewhere in the world, and it didn't in South Africa. And this is something we have to think about very, very deeply. Because we took great pains to pull the international community with us around building up a tactical plan of being in a very different place in 2019 from where we are. So this whole business about mechanisms of implementation cannot be understated. Cannot be overstated, rather. Because this is really still our big challenge. Let me return to some of these points, though. The first of those is that, and today is Africa Day at this symposium, is Africa genuinely is the determinant of what the 21st century is going to be for the world as a whole. We know that we're going to be the most populous continent. We know we're going to have the most youthful population. And we have an important choice to make. We can either convert that demographic into a demographic dividend and gain from it, like India has in modern times, like China has in modern times, or we can have a demographic burden where this large population, if it continues with the stats that we currently have, will in fact become a burden to the system rather than organizing for what Africa really needs to be, and that's the global laboratory on how water and sanitation in the whole world is going to look in the 21st century. And I want to encourage you to take this very discussion point into all of your workshops, because there is a possibility here that we need to engage, we need to grapple with, we need to make it work. The next point I want to make is the issue about partnerships. And Dulai in his opening comments talked about this. And partnerships, and he touched on it actually, is not about just shaking of the hands and signing of agreements. But it is about organizing to work out what you are going to contribute to it. Now, Professor Wiseman Nkushlu was the first CEO of NEPAD. I was with him when he gave one of his maiden speeches to heads of state in Africa. And he got very unpopular for the comment that he made that day. He said, whatever plan we develop for this African continent, we must ensure that at least 50% of the funding of that plan comes from Africa. Otherwise, we will not own that plan. And the reason folk were angry with him is because many other players in the system, including players in South Africa, thought about that plan as a proposal for donors, thought about that plan as a mechanism to get more ODA. But like the other countries who have used those facilities properly, if you don't have your own investment, you cannot own your plan, you cannot drive your plan, and you cannot drive your strategy. And we really need to think about this long and deep and hard. And I think what we've been able to demonstrate in these couple of days here is that the WRC and its partners, and let me emphasize the partners, because you have demonstrated to the world that you've already made great contributions to where we can get to. It's around the folk waking up to the right kinds of mechanisms to put that in place. It is about municipalities getting adventurous about putting these new technologies into their systems, because these are the technologies of tomorrow. It is about Treasury looking at their management model of funds, of the National Revenue Fund, which is more than 500 years old. You know, it needs to catch up with the 21st century. I mean, the mechanisms of the channels of movement of funds from Treasury to a budget vote in a government department, and then you depend on the discretion of that government department before it gets to an implementation point, isn't something that works anymore in many, many sectors. And I think that there are many of these things where the people are in this room have the power to change. We need to express the will to change it in a very serious way. The last point I want to make before I round up with a couple of slides is that we need to re-visualize value chains and what partnerships need to be in those value chains. And one of the slides I used to use in a presentation many years ago was a slide of what I asked my children at that time, they're all older now, about how they would solve problems. I'll only quote from one of them because she's not a teenager yet, so she won't mind. Her view was that if you need to solve a problem, you need to ask Tinkerbell. Now that sounds a bit odd, but there's a deep meaning inside that. It says sometimes for the solutions that you need, you actually need to look in the most outrageous places. That you have to make the unthinkable connections. That you have to reach out in your partnership to people you hadn't thought about before. And I think this is precisely what we need to do. So I don't know whether you noticed this, but in the last 2 days, you were sitting here among researchers and innovators and policymakers, and we've done that before. But in addition to that, you've also had investors and enablers and people who have nothing to do with water. And we must continue to do this, because for us to get to where we need to be, and we all agree on where we need to be, we need very new partnerships, we need very new partnership mechanisms, and we need to build very different teams. So colleagues, on that note, I want to run through just a few slides. First, a tribute, because I'm going to be using him, one of the great sons of Africa, Ali Mazrui. For those of you who are too young to know who Ali Mazrui is, go to Google and watch the videos. But he is really one of the great sons of Africa, a Kenyan who has changed the way many people look at the people on this continent. And I had the privilege, when I first started working at the WRC, of spending 3 days with him, which was an incredible experience. And one of the things that he talked about is how the rest of Africa looks at South Africa. And he described it with 4 words that began with the letter V. And I want to do a refresher on that. The first V, he said, is victim. Because when South Africa was straining under apartheid, even when the rest of the continent was liberated, there's a reason we talk about Agenda 2063. Because Agenda 2063 is the centenary anniversary of the liberation of Africa, which was 1963. This country was not liberated in 1963. We had to wait 31 years more before that happened. But he said that while we were groaning under the strains of apartheid, there was an African solidarity and an empathy around that victimhood. And we all know this. We stand here as beneficiaries of the African solidarity that ensured our liberation. He then went to the next V. And the next V is the V for victory. Because South Africa's own emancipation from apartheid was the completion of the liberation of the continent as a whole. And this was celebrated far and wide, all across this wonderful continent. And that V for victory was a very powerful V for victory. But he said, your country is a powerful country. It's economically powerful, it's militarily powerful, it is politically powerful. And one of the things that the rest of the continent must worry about is the other V, the possibility of South Africa becoming a villain. And while the 2 earlier pictures was from a long time ago, this picture was from 2 weeks ago inside South Africa, and we know this. The whole concept of the regional hegemon is a very real concept. We must absorb it, we must understand it, we must understand that we're giving meaning to that one V in his 4 Vs that we didn't like. And we have to get past this point. And we have to get past this point in a way that demonstrates to the rest of Africa the humility that we need to show about this issue. But he also talked about a 4th V. And the way he phrased it in one of his lectures is that this continent has invested in you and your liberation and your empowerment. And in turn, we, as Africans outside South Africa, have an expectation. And that expectation was expressed for me in the most powerful way by this picture in this symposium. For those of you who don't recognize the people in the picture, the person on the left-hand side is Ma Florence Chilitsi. She's from the MUS project in the village of Chakama in Limpopo. And they were demonstrating their wonderful solution. And they developed a package of tools. And this project was co-sponsored by the African Development Bank. And the African Development Bank invested in this so that we could take these models, demonstrate them in South Africa, and then transport them around the continent to organize for continental development. And in her manner, in the way she wanted to present the tools to Wambui Gichuri, who's the director of water in the African Development Bank, she went down on her knees. And in response, in the most humble way, Wambui did exactly the same thing. So they exchanged those tools with that humility around this exchange. Because this is the manner in which we should approach that fourth V. Not from a position of superiority, but from a position of humility. And that fourth V is vanguard. This country has a historical, it has a current, and it has a future responsibility to be one of the vanguards of African development. So, colleagues, it is in the hands of you and I to make Ali Mizrui's words true. And I do believe we can. And I do believe that what we have done in the last 2 days, what we're going to continue to do today, will help a great deal on that journey. So on that note, I want to thank all of you for your wonderful participation and remind you of the words of another philosopher, one of the great philosophers of my time. His name is Bob Marley. And it lies with us. It is our job to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery. All of these constraints that we talk about, we have an ability to get past it if we put our minds in the right place. And no one else can do it for us, because none but ourselves can free our minds. Thank you very, very much indeed.